Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Annette Zimmermann. I'm a lecturer at the Department of Philosophy, and I'm a moral and political philosopher of AI. So that just means that I'm interested in the question of how AI and similar technologies impact society and how we should design AI in order to protect social values like justice, equality, and democratic legitimacy. Now, today I'd like to talk about the question of whether there are some AI tools that should never be built in the first place. So we'll take a look at the ethics and politics of AI optimization. Let's begin by taking a look at three recent cases involving AI tools. The first one that you see at the top left of your screen is an AI-powered facial beauty assessment tool. For instance, one by a company called Quobus Studio, which compares users' faces to a supposedly objective standard of beauty and offers recommendations for cosmetic surgery on that basis. Now, similar beauty assessment tools have been shown to reinforce racial inequality by entrenching Eurocentric beauty standards that really favor white faces. So this kind of AI tool and other similar tools often score white faces as more objectively beautiful. The second example that I'd like to show you is a recent fitness tracker called Halo by the company Amazon. And this tool claims to be able to evaluate your emotions by listening to your tone of voice. The crux here is that female users actually report receiving feedback from this health band, warning them that their tone sounds a little too condescending, a little too dismissive. And of course, this raises an immediate ethical and political worry, given that there exists a set of negative social stereotypes concerning the tone of women's speech. Consider, for example, this common trope of women being very hysterical and emotional. This kind of tone feedback can really reinforce those stereotypes to its users, because of course, these users are aware of the presence of those assumptions in society. Finally, there's the third case, which you can see on the right side of your screen. And this is a facial recognition system that is used in order to predict the social orientation of a person. This tool's creators also actually claim to be able to predict other kinds of characteristics, such as a person's propensity for violent criminality, all by looking at the features of their face. Now, when the researcher who developed this tool was interviewed by The Guardian, he stated, "I was shocked it was so easy." And indeed, the results seem to check out. While humans are accurately able to predict features like sexual orientation in 61% of cases of facial data from men and 54% of cases for facial data from women, the researchers in this case actually claimed that their tool performed accurately in 91% of cases for men and 83% of cases for women. Now, at first glance, you might kind of think, well, that all sounds bad, but we don't have to use these tools ourselves if we don't want to. So you might therefore think, well, at the end of the day, these are just weird AI tools. They're solving weird kinds of problems, achieving weird goals. But I want to argue that that's not an innocent problem. Which goals we choose to pursue when we use automation really matters for social justice. All of these cases raise a fundamental philosophical question. Even if these tools work reasonably well, should some of them not be built in the first place? Now, that's a really controversial view. So many people, not just tech industry practitioners, think that there are really strong reasons not to stifle innovation. So these powerful forms of AI and machine learning can really help us solve complex social problems at a massive scale and speed, unlike humans can. And of course, that much is true. Many forms of AI actually do have this really positive potential. Not all forms of AI are inherently objectionable. So in short, there's a really strong general presumption in favor of continuing to build, deploy, and optimize AI. There's a blanket presumption in favor of incremental AI optimization. The idea here is that even if AI is not perfect right now, we should actually just try to make it better as much as we can in any given scenario. That will slowly help us get rid of the moral and political problems that appear in an AI context. But sometimes, actually, that other strategy, so not deploying and perhaps not even building certain forms of AI, might be more just and ultimately better for society. In other words, there are important and, in my view, underappreciated reasons why we ought to question this blanket presumption in favor of optimization in several cases. Now, if we care about making society more just, how do we actually decide between these two strategies? Now, I think it's going to depend on the social context in which we actually design and deploy AI. After all, technological systems really interact with social systems. They don't operate in a moral and political vacuum. Data can not only mirror existing structures of social injustice, it can actually amplify them further and automate these biased ways of thinking, all while, of course, fooling us into thinking that those biased AI outputs are actually the result of an inherently neutral and scientific process. Now, when we use AI and similar tools, we can easily forget that we ourselves have to ask these really hard questions about what we want to achieve when we automate, what our goals and purposes really are. For these reasons, simply making things better on a tech level, for instance, by simply scaling up an accurate decision process with an unjust purpose, is not going to be good enough from the perspective of justice. So if a social practice is already unjust, consider, for instance, the criminal justice process in many different countries, we should be very cautious about simply making that practice run more smoothly and accurately via sophisticated technology. Now, we also see why this kind of perspective is really important when we reflect on the three cases that we started with earlier. Consider again that gay facial recognition case. The crux here is that the kind of tool that we see in this case claims to do this kind of prediction task purely by analyzing images of people's faces, so by measuring the distance between a person's facial features and by evaluating data about so-called gender atypical grooming styles, for example. So this tool was, of course, met with significant criticism, making this particular kind of inference, or an inference from blunt facial measurements to a prediction of a person's characteristics and preferences, comes with really significant historical baggage. In particular, critics asked at the time when this tool came out, did this method of inferring these characteristics purely from the way a person looks not echo these discredited, racist, pseudoscientific methods and ideas that we know from phrenology, physiognomy, and eugenics? Using a similar type of inferential method actually might risk communicating and reinforcing the same harmful ideas propagated by historical eugenicists. The idea that it's not only possible to look like a criminal or to look gay, but also that it's just true that the way a person looks is an apt and accurate basis from which to make these inferential judgments. All in all, some AI tools may work fairly well across the board by the lights of their own technological success conditions. So inaccuracy as such is not really the central problem here. But their very use may be harmful if they rely on methods of inference that echo these unjust historical practices. In such cases, building and using these tools may itself constitute something that philosophers have called expressive harm. So that means communicating a demeaning and harmful message which takes on an unjust social meaning in light of existing historical and social norms, assumptions, and experiences. So in all of these cases, it's not really enough to ask whether a tool is accurate enough, whether it does what it's supposed to do, even though, of course, tech industry practitioners tend to really focus on exactly that question. We also have to ask a deeper question. What's the purpose of building a given AI tool? And is that a good purpose? So if we have an accuracy mindset about AI optimization, we're going to ask questions like, can my AI tool predict if someone is gay? But if we adopt, in addition to that, the kind of purpose mindset that I think we should adopt, we'll ask instead, why do we want or need AI to predict that someone is gay to begin with? How does predicting sexual orientation or propensity for violent criminality serve or indeed hinder justice? Now, back to our two strategies. On the one hand, we have build and deploy and optimize. And on the other hand, we have don't build and don't deploy at all. Now, again, the first strategy is really appealing in many cases. Technologists, so the reasoning goes at least, can at least attempt to fix what is fixable in the short run, and that is bad technology. After all, fixing society as a whole by eradicating all forms of bias and injustice would be a really big and hard task. But it's not like the second strategy has been entirely unsuccessful. Actually, in recent years, multiple cities, including San Francisco, have decided to stop deploying facial recognition technology in their law enforcement practices, again, due to its racially biased effects. The question here is, could non-deployment actually be a good and just promoting strategy in other cases? My view is that it's not plausible to think that one strategy is always going to be better. There's no blanket solution because the right strategy will always be responsive to the specific social context of an AI tool. But here's the thing. People who are radical optimization supporters, so those who are very much against this idea of don't build and don't deploy, do think that there is a blanket solution here. Again, it's this idea that making things better is always good. And of course, there's often financial motives behind this. So tech industry giants will try to maintain their market dominance by prioritizing speed over safety and ethics, by chasing the state of the art, by moving fast and breaking things. But actually, many tech practitioners also have genuinely ethical motives here. They might reasonably think that optimization is actually beneficial and not at all at odds with corporate profit aims. The Alphabet Workers Union, for example, stated recently on their website, this is a quote, "We will work with those affected by our technology to ensure that it serves the public good. Alphabet can make money without doing evil." Now, finally, there are simply just pragmatic motives that favor optimization. Innovation has always required experimenting, dealing with surprises and even accidents, and that ultimately helps us advance. So for this reason, there's a widespread attitude of trying things out and tinkering with technology in order to ultimately try to fix it. Now, in what follows, I'd like to just give you 3 arguments for why we should question this blanket endorsement of AI optimization. The first reason is that even AI tools without an explicitly bad purpose can actually enable nefarious secondary uses. Seemingly apolitical AI tools can facilitate things like political persecution of vulnerable groups. As an example, consider the company Megvii. It's a Chinese company that developed an app called Face++, which is very similar to the Quovis tool that I showed you before, another beauty scoring tool. But in this case, that wasn't the only purpose for which Megvii used its expertise in facial recognition technology. It then ended up collaborating with the company Huawei to test a so-called Uyghur alarm, which was designed to recognize the faces of members of the Uyghur minority and immediately alert the police. Now, when nefarious purposes motivate efforts to build and optimize AI, we have really weighty moral and political reasons to critique such efforts. Now, thinking back to our facial recognition case, the researcher who was interviewed by The Guardian, the creator of this gay facial recognition tool, said in an interview, "I stumbled upon these results and I was actually close to putting them in a drawer and not publishing because I had a very good life without this paper being out. But then a colleague asked me if I would be able to look myself in the mirror if one day a company or a government deployed a similar technique to hurt people." Now, in my view, there's reason to doubt this argument's logic because, of course, nothing prevents a so-called bad actor from repurposing knowledge and capabilities that we gain from some AI tool that was first developed by a well-intentioned researcher. Once that technology is out, it's very hard to stop it. Thirdly, and relatedly, earlier decisions to automate a given process can have really irreversible consequences. So even very secure and controlled AI deployment that is designed for research purposes only doesn't necessarily avoid unjust harms. One recent example of this was a controversial facial recognition data set developed by a university research team that was taken down because of ethical concerns, but that was subsequently used over and over again in hundreds of research papers. So again, once the technology is out there, it can be very hard to take it back. Now, for these 3 reasons, thinking hard about the purpose and goals associated with a specific AI tool and how those purposes and goals are going to interact with the messy complexity of our social world is going to be really important, much more important than AI optimization as such. Only if we do this can we decide which one of these 2 strategies we should adopt in a given case, if making society more just is what we ultimately care about. So in other words, getting clear on the value and purpose of AI is going to be much more important than the rush to make it better. Thank you.